So I want to read a little bit from the Tainos by Irving Rouse. I left off over here. Oh, that just fell off. Okay. Probably have to get a new tab after that. I think it was here. By combining documentary and archaeological evidence, ethnohistorians have been able to demonstrate that Zemis were worshipped in homes and in caves throughout western and eastern Taino territory, especially in Jamaica. The sources do not mention the construction of specialized structures for the worship of Zemis, nor have archaeologists encountered the remains of central courts that could have been used for that purpose. However, the ball game is recorded for the western and probably also the eastern Tainos. It must have been played on unstructured grounds. No traces of ball courts have been found. The western Tainos are said to have been more peaceful than the classic and eastern Tainos. This was to be expected, for they lived in isolation, bordered only by the classic Tainos and the Guanahatabes, who do not seem to have been aggressive toward their neighbors. The western Tainos' attitude worked to Columbus's advantage after the landfall and during his subsequent voyage through the Bahamas to central Cuba. The inhabitants of both places received him and his men hospitably and assisted them in recuperating from their long voyage. The eastern Tainos were more hostile because they had to contend with island Carib raids from the south. It was only natural, therefore, for them to react against Columbus when he encountered them during his second voyage. Their hostility has created the false impression that they were island Caribs, an error that has only recently been corrected by archaeological and historical research. We do not know whether the eastern Tainos used the bow and arrow. They probably did, for this weapon is present among the island Caribs to their south and among the classic Tainos of St. Croix, Puerto Rico, and the eastern tip of Hispaniola to their north and west. The bow and arrow are not exclusively an island Carib weapon, as some authorities have assumed. Levels of development. Columbus was disappointed that the Tainos were less civilized than the East Asians he had expected to find. Nevertheless, classic Taino culture appears to have been evolving toward full civilization. Its bearers possessed a good agricultural base and were organized into complex chiefdoms. If they had been allowed a few centuries of reprieve from Spanish rule, they might well have bridged the gap across Guanahatabe territory in western Cuba and developed the kind of commercial linkage with the civilized people of Middle America that they had already established with the inhabitants of northern South America. This would have made it possible for them to acquire writing, statehood, and other elements of the mainland civilizations, as their fellow islanders, the British and the Japanese, had already done in Europe and Asia. The classic Taino culture has been termed formative because it was on the verge of civilization. By contrast, the eastern and western Tainos were on a somewhat lower level of cultural development, which Julian H. Stewart has called tropical forest. I see what year this was published, because sometimes, where is it? 1992. So yeah, this book is like a couple decades old. So yeah, neighboring ethnic groups. The Tainos cannot be understood in isolation. They must also be viewed in terms of their immediate neighbors. The Guanahatabes and island Caribs with whom they interacted and exchanged cultural, linguistic, and biological traits. There is no evidence that they were in direct contact with the ethnic groups beyond these two, in either Middle or South America, and hence the mainland will not be considered here. Guanahatabes. Scholars have mistakenly called the western neighbors of the Taino by another name, Siboney. That term actually applies to a local group of western Tainos in central Cuba. The Guanahatabes lived at the far end of Cuba, separating the western Tainos from the fully civilized peoples of Middle America. They must have spoken a language different from the neighbors, for Columbus's Taino interpreter was unable to converse with them. Unfortunately, they became extinct before their language could be studied. We know it only from local place names, which are not sufficient to determine its affiliation. None of the chroniclers had an opportunity to study the local culture before it too became extinct. The Tainos told them that the Guanahatabes were, quote, savages having neither houses nor farms, subsisting on game captured in the mountains or on turtle and fish. Where's the beginning? Oh, there. Keegan has questioned the validity of this evidence because it is hearsay. He argues that the chroniclers were reporting legend rather than historical reality. It is possible that the Guanahatabes were a local group of Tainos. However, no sites inhabited by Tainos have been found in their territory. Even though it is one of the more intensively investigated parts of the West Indies, the fact that the Guanahatabes spoke a different language also indicates that they formed a separate ethnic group. Archaeological research in Guanahatabe territory has shown only the remains of prehistoric peoples who lived in the open as well as in caves, and relied heavily on shellfish as well as on fish and game. They used the techniques of chipping and grinding to make tools of stone, bone, and shell. Apparently they were organized into small bands rather than villages. No demonstrably prehistoric pottery has been found in their territory. Given the similarity between these remains and the ethno-historical accounts, it is reasonable to assume that the peoples who deposited them were ancestral to the Guanahatabes. Both groups are generally thought to be relics of the original population of the islands, pushed back by the Tainos into the peripheral position they occupied in Columbus's time. Archaeologists apply the term archaic to cultures such as theirs, which lacked pottery, agriculture, and sedentary life. Little is known about the relations between Guanahatabes and the natives of southern Florida. Both populations were on the archaic level of culture and social development in the time of Columbus, and their archaeological remains show some resemblances, especially in shell work and woodwork. To what extent these resemblances are the results of interaction or of parallel adaptation to similar ecological conditions remains to be determined. Island Caribs. The members of the second peripheral group call themselves Carib or Kalina. Ethnohistorians have added the prefix island to distinguish them from Caribs proper, who lived on the mainland. In the time of Columbus, the island Caribs occupied the Windward Islands, Guadeloupe, and possibly also neighboring islands at the southern end of the Leewards. They were situated between the eastern Tainos and the Arawaks and Caribs proper, who lived side by side on the mainland to their south. Their overall population was small compared to that of the Tainos. They were concentrated on the larger islands such as Guadeloupe and Martinique. Some smaller islands such as Barbados were apparently depopulated in the time of Columbus. Unlike the Tainos and Guanahatabes, they had arrived in the West Indies recently enough to have retained traditions of their mainland origin. They told the Europeans that they had come from the south, and they conquered an ethnic group named Igneri or Ayeri. They are thought to have been mainland Caribs who imposed their name on the Igneris. We are here concerned with conditions among the island Caribs in the time of Columbus. Unfortunately, our information about them comes mostly from the French, who colonized Guadeloupe and Martinique more than a century later. By that time, an influx of Taino people fleeing from repression by the Spaniards in Hispaniola and Puerto Rico had modified the island Caribs' language and culture. We must attempt to take these influences into consideration. Because of the change in name from Igneri to Island Carib, linguists originally thought that the new ethnic group spoke a Caribbean language. They found, however, that the Island Caribs had an Arawakan language as distinct from that of the Tainos to their north as from the Arawaks on the mainland to their south. To account for this unexpected relation, they have hypothesized that the mainland Carib conquerors of the Igneris settled among them without displacing them, and eventually adopted their language. Indeed, many linguists prefer to call the island Caribs language Igneri. In French colonial times, if not earlier, the island Carib men also spoke Pidgin or Pidgin? Not pigeon. Is it Pidgin? Language among themselves, which was basically Caribbean. The Caribs and Arawaks, who still live side by side at the Guianas, use this Pidgin to communicate with each other. Douglas Taylor and Brand J. Hoff theorized that the Carib warriors who conquered the Igneris retained the mainland Pidgin as a symbol of their origin. They probably also used it to trade with their neighbors on... No. What is it? Pidgin or Pidgin? Where was I? I'm getting distracted. They probably also used it to trade with their neighbors on the mainland, as noted below. That's pigeon, is it? I'm getting confused. Is that how you spell pigeon? According to French observers, the 17th century island Caribs made only undecorated pottery, reminiscent of that among their contemporary namesakes on the mainland. Whether the pottery was produced by the men or by the women is unclear. Archaeologists have been unable to locate sites containing this kind of pottery, or to determine whether it was already in existence when Columbus arrived more than a century earlier. Repeated attempts to locate native villages mentioned in the historic sources have also failed, and so have efforts to find native sites containing European trade objects. Consequently, the results of archaeological research cannot yet be used to expand our knowledge of island Carib culture. The invading warriors appear to have imposed the masculine aspects of their ancestral Carib culture on the domestic life of the preceding Igneri culture. In French colonial times, and presumably earlier, the male inhabitants of each village lived together in a men's house, from which they visited their wives in surrounding family homes. The villages are not reported to have contained plazas, ball courts, temples, or other public structures, but there is unconfirmed evidence that the 17th century island Caribs played ball. They could have inherited this practice from their Ignari predecessors, or they could have acquired it from the Tainos, who took refuge among them during the 16th century. The island Carib men of the 15th century emphasized warfare, raiding Taino villages to obtain additional wives. Columbus rescued several Taino women when he visited island Carib villages on Guadeloupe during his second voyage. He returned them to their homes in the Greater Antilles. We do not know how the island Carib men of his time obtained wives from within their own group. Island Carib men of the 16th and 17th centuries, if not earlier, lacked permanent chiefs. They elected temporary war chiefs to lead their raids, more skilled in the use of bows and arrows than the Tainos. They ate bits of the flesh of opposing warriors in order to acquire the latter's prowess. Our term cannibal is derived from this practice. It is a corruption of the Spanish word caribal. The men also undertook long-distance trading expeditions to South America. These too were led by temporary chiefs elected for the purpose. The men presumably used their Pitkin language on these trips. They built excellent dugout canoes, which they employed for hunting and fishing as well as for warfare and trade. The women continued to practice the Ignari form of agriculture, which appears to have been similar to that of the Eastern Tainos, and to gather wild fruits and vegetables. Like the Ignari before them, they seem to have worshipped Zemis in their house, if not in shrine caves. Island Carib culture may be classed with Western and Eastern Taino, Ignari, and Arawak cultures on the tropical forest level of development. All five lagged behind classic Taino culture. Nevertheless, the island Caribs were not savages as has sometimes been assumed because of their ritualistic cannibalism. Conclusions. A ship's captain interested in Caribbean ethnohistory once expressed surprise to me that he had been unable to find the names of Taino or Arawak on any of his charts. Why, he wondered, is this region named after the island Caribs, who were peripherally located, occupied much less territory than the Tainos, had a much smaller population, and lagged in cultural development? The captain was perceptive. The Tainos have not received the recognition they deserve for their role in the events relating to the conquest of the Americas. Not only has their identity suffered because they had no overall name for themselves, but the island Caribs attracted more attention because of their warlike nature and their practice of cannibalism, which the Spanish colonists greatly exaggerated in order to justify enslaving them. The two groups had many other differences. Taino homes were clustered around a central plaza where both men and women participated in ceremonies, dances, and ball games. Island Carib homes were instead grouped around a house where the men lived and carried out a gender-oriented range of activities. The Taino spoke a single language. The island Carib supplemented theirs with a pitkin, which was used only in the men's house and on expeditions to the mainland. The Tainos emphasized religion and burial, the island Caribs warfare and trade. The Taino had hereditary chiefs, the island Caribs only temporary chiefs elected to lead their expeditions. The Tainos did service or made payments to obtain their brides. The island Caribs raided for theirs. The Tainos had a homogeneous society, and the island Caribs a dual one, in which the men dominated the women. The third ethnic group, the Guanahatabes, lived in mobile bands rather than sedentary villages. They lacked the pottery and agriculture shared by the Tainos and the Caribs. Because the Tainos were the first inhabitants of the Western Hemisphere to come in contact with Europeans, They played a major role in the so-called Columbian Exchange, whereby the Spaniards and natives traded diseases, crops, artifacts, customs, and ideas. The contributions of the Tainos to that exchange are discussed in the epilogue. The ethno-historians' division of Taino culture into Western, classic, and, thanks to recent archaeological research, Eastern variants, foreshadows another theme that will recur in subsequent chapters: the contrast between conditions in the center of the distribution of a population group and on its frontiers. The central conditions in this case among the classic Tainos are typical of a group's culture and language. Those who live on the frontiers, and as the Western and Eastern Tainos did, tend to be more conservative and to lag in cultural and linguistic development. At the same time, because of their peripheral position, they are able to interact more closely with the neighboring ethnic groups and hence become transitional to them. A third recurring subject is the duality of culture among the island Caribs. We shall find that the prehistoric peoples in the West Indies had other dualities, and probably not based upon gender, and shall examine the effect of these dualities on the development of new peoples and cultures. Ethnohistorians have inferred conclusions about the origins of the Tainos and their neighbors from the documentary evidence. The Guanahatabes' peripheral position and low level of development has led to the belief that they were a relict of the original peoples of the Antilles. Their ancestors could have come from Middle America, taking advantage of the counter-current that flows along the south side of Cuba, or from South America following the main thrust of currents into the West Indies. The ancestors of the Tainos were the next people to invade the West Indies, by alternatively calling them Arawaks. Ethnohistorians have implied that they were an offshoot of the ethnic group of that name which inhabited parts of the Guianas and Trinidad in the time of Columbus. In fact, the two groups were descended from a common ancestor. It is generally agreed that the progenitors of the Tainos rode to the south equatorial current and the outpouring of water from the Orinoco River in the Windward Islands, whence they continued through the Leeward Islands and the Greater Antille to the Bahamian archipelago, leaving only an isolated pocket of the Guanahatabes at the western end of Cuba. These events must have happened some time ago, for the Tainos did not recollect having come from the mainland. They believed that they had emerged from caves in Hispaniola. The traditions of the island Carib warriors indicate that their ancestors followed in the footsteps of the ancestors of the Tainos. They too came from the Guianas and Trinidad, where they had lived side by side with the Arawaks. By the time of Columbus, they had penetrated the Lesser Antilles, but only as far as the southern end of the Leeward Islands. If my inferences from their traditions are correct, they arrived in war parties, which conquered the Ignari population, subjugated or drove out its men, and took its women as wives. The warriors were apparently too few in numbers to have substantially changed the biological composition of the previous population, or to have replaced its language and the domestic aspects of its culture. The invaders were only able to impose their own name, their Pitkin language, and masculine aspects of their ancestral culture. In other words, they were eventually assimilated into the local population, like the Normans who invaded England and the Moors who conquered southern Spain. These working hypotheses have been inferred from the geographical and ethnohistorical data presented in this chapter, and are subject to testing against other lines of evidence. The work done to test them is discussed in the next chapter. So next time I read this book will be The Ancestries of the Tainos, chapter 2. So put this back, see if it sticks. Oh no, it doesn't stick. I'll just make it a bookmark for now. Yeah. So thank you for watching. I hope it helped you fall asleep. Yeah, thank you for watching my videos and subscribing and all that.